All right, guys, we're going to try to do this through video. So we're going to start Unit 5, which is going to cover sections 4.1 through 4.7. We're going to skip 4.5 and 4.6, so our new Unit 5 will be 4.1, 2, 3, 4, and 7. A little bit different than originally planned. So let's get started and talk about 4.1, where we're going to talk about maximum and minimum values. Some of the most important applications that we do in calculus are trying to optimize things, either trying to find the greatest or the least value of a certain situation, the best way of doing something possibly. This can be done by finding the maximum and minimum value of that function. So we're going to talk first about finding the absolute extrema, the very, very, very highest point or the very, very lowest point on a certain interval, absolute, maximum, or minimum. If you look at the three graphs that I've given you, you can see where there is or is not a maximum or minimum. On the first one, this very lowest point down here would be a minimum value. On that interval from A to B, that is the lowest point that there is. He's an absolute minimum. This endpoint right here, 2, 5, would then be my absolute maximum. He's the highest point that this graph ever touches in that interval. In my middle graph, this bottom point is my minimum, but the top one is not a maximum because it's an open circle. Since there is no value there, we can't call it a maximum. Now, maybe the point right before that is a maximum, but that endpoint we would not consider a maximum because it's an open circle there. Kind of the same idea with this third graph. This bottom part right here, yeah, it's the lowest point, but because there's no value there, there's an open circle, we would not consider that a minimum, but we would consider that upper point, that point 2, 5, a maximum. Okay, so as long as there is a value there, then we can say it's an absolute extrema. Okay, the extreme value theorem says that if f is continuous, so you have a function that's continuous, no holes, no gaps, no vertical asymptotes, on a certain interval from A to B, then f both has to have a minimum and a maximum. So that's kind of like the first picture we talked about. As long as it's continuous, then there should not only be a minimum, but there should also be a maximum on that interval. Okay? If I gave you this picture, we can ask the questions a couple of different ways. And so we can write an extrema, either a maximum or a minimum, a couple of different ways. We could say that the absolute maximum occurs at the point 3, 5, so using it as a point. We could say that the absolute maximum is f of 3, which equals 5, and so it happens when x is 3, but the maximum value is 5, so a little bit of more of a function notation idea. A third way of saying it is we can say that the absolute maximum occurs when x is 3. So we've just got to be careful depending on how they ask the question. We can say that a maximum or minimum happens when, and then that when would be an x equals. But what is the absolute maximum or minimum? That would be 5, which is the y value. So you can see that extrema are y values, not x values. They happen when x, but the actual absolute maximum or minimum value is the y value. Okay? All right, so there's absolute extrema, the very, very, very highest point and the very, very, very lowest point, but there's also what we call relative or local extrema, okay? And so that's kind of where we have those, can I call them humps, okay, where they might be a relatively high point, but they're not the highest point. So if you look at the picture that I drew here, we have some relative or local maximum, but there's an absolute maximum on a different area because it's the highest point of my graph. Or I could have a relative or local minimum where it kind of goes down a little bit, but I can also have an absolute minimum, the very, very, very lowest point. Okay, now relative minimums can also be absolute minimums. We'll see that here in a second. But relative is just kind of a higher or lower point, but absolute is the highest or lowest point.